Hi everyone, good Wednesday afternoon and welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the News and Politics Show. Would like to thank Laura Afonso and all the guests that came in to talk about new food and drink here in the state. But we're going to go a little south, as we usually do once a week, to check in with Jennifer Lawless down at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, how are things?
They're plugging along.
They are plugging along. Obviously, this time last week you were in the, not you, but the state proverbially, in the hot seat with what had transpired between the governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. Does it look like things have cooled off down there?
It's a little unsettled because things have cooled off in that the conversation seems to have moved to behind closed doors, but there are still 2 and possibly 3 elected officials who a lot of people are waiting on to resign. Ralph Northam has said that he's not. Justin Fairfax wants to wait for an investigation that clears him. Mark Herring, who was sort of the least offensive of the offenders, I think a week ago would have thought he would be governor by now, and now that doesn't look to be the case. So there just still seems to be this pretty substantial air of uncertainty. But the longer it goes on, the more likely it is that nobody's going to step down.
And how unlikely does that make that scenario with, again, those top 3 all being Democratic officials? Is there just blood in the water? Are they all just jockeying to climb over, except, the governor? But, I mean, you say it's behind closed doors, but what do you think that political climate looks like?
I mean, I think some of it has to do with what can make the Democratic Party remain competitive. We have off-year elections here, so the entire state legislature is currently campaigning for re-election in November.
Okay.
And the way that they handle this kind of situation, the way that they speak and talk about racism, the way that they speak and talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment, all plays into these campaigns. And so I think everybody is sort of taking a step back to try and figure out what makes the most sense, not only for these particular individuals, but also for the slate of Democratic candidates and the future of the Democratic Party.
You do raise a good point. Obviously, being in cycle, being this year, it's obviously going to be topics on the campaign trail. Let's get a little outside Virginia. Let's head up to maybe Minnesota. Comments made on Twitter this week by Representative Omar regarding Israel. Calls for her to apologize. She did apologize. Here we are Wednesday. What next?
So obviously, she apologized for what many perceive to be her retweeting and commenting on anti-Semitic tropes. And I think this highlights a couple of things. First, the Democratic Party has demonstrated that it's far more willing than the Republican Party to hold its own members accountable when they say things that fly in the face of democratic values. We've seen that with calls for Ralph Northam to step down because of racism. We've seen that with calls for Justin Fairfax to step down because of allegations of sexual assault. We saw that with Al Franken as well. And now we're seeing an immediate request for an apology when it comes to anti-Semitism. And so, I think that it really we see in these examples a clear distinction between the way that the party's leadership compared to Republican Party leaders handle their own members. That said, the Republicans have had no problem jumping on this and suggesting that there's no place in Congress for somebody like this when it's a standard to which they've obviously never held their own members.
So we think she survives. We think the issue gets behind her. Does it have any remaining legs?
Well, the thing that's tricky about the House of Representatives is that there's a permanent campaign. So from the minute you get elected, you're campaigning for re-election. And the first time that you're elected is obviously the hardest race you'll ever run. But that second time comes in a close second, which means that that's the best shot at somebody defeating you. And so when a freshman member of Congress makes a mistake or says something that's racist or anti-Semitic or sexist or anything else, it suggests to other potential candidates that maybe this person is vulnerable. So even if this doesn't have any more legs as far as Nancy Pelosi or the institution of Congress right now is concerned, I wouldn't be surprised if it makes its way not only into the general election, but perhaps primaries for 2020 as well.
There have been those who tried to say that by her comments or retweets or accusations that she was not making anti-Semitic remarks. Is there any validity to that?
I mean, if it walks like a duck, and basically it doesn't even matter because perceptions drive reality in politics. And the perception of impropriety, the perception of racism, the perception of anti-Semitism is as important as any of those things. And there's no question, regardless of her intent, that that's how the tweets were perceived.
Let's get really local here back in Rhode Island. A new poll released yesterday by the Citizens for Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness released a poll that said 73.8% of people in Rhode Island believe that abortion should not be legal up until birth. Let's talk a little bit. You've had some pretty strong reactions to this poll.
So as somebody whose entire career is based on survey research, when I see a poll that's completely insane, I feel like I have to call it out. And frankly, nobody favors abortion until birth. That's not a thing. No doctor would perform abortion until birth. If you try to end a pregnancy and a fetus is viable, the fetus is delivered. So these are insanely severe mischaracterizations of what is actually at stake in Rhode Island. That is not what Roe v. Wade allows. That is not what codifying Roe versus Wade would allow. And, frankly, I was somewhat surprised that only 73% of people were opposed to that. I would have thought it would be closer to 100%.
Well, I appreciate, Jennifer, you're taking the time to Skype in today here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. As always, it will be a whole new week next week when we hear from you. So thank you again for your time.
Of course.
Okay, thanks. We're going to let Jennifer Lawless go. We're going to get a little more local here, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.